infinite amount of data. But in practice, you're only going to have like 2 or 3 years of data on a teacher's performance before you might want to make a decision about whether you want to give that teacher more training or change the class they're teaching or something like that. So when you only have a few years of data, the value-added estimates are going to be much more unstable, as we talked about, and that's potentially going to reduce the utility of value-added performance evaluation. So an interesting question from a policy perspective is how big that problem is. So as an illustration, we're again going to analyze the impacts of selecting or rewarding teachers based on their value added. Focus again on, let's say, identifying these top 5% teachers, but only using a few years of data. How much are we going to lose because we make mistakes in evaluating teachers when we only have limited amount of data? And that's what this figure shows you. So the red line is the number that I quoted before. If you had an infinite amount of data on each teacher, you could figure out perfectly what a teacher's value added is. Then the top 5% teachers are going to generate $1.4 million of value. But if you only had 1 classroom's worth of data, or 2 classrooms, or 4 classrooms worth of data, you are going to misestimate some teachers' value added. And so the gains you're going to achieve are going to be smaller than that 1.4 million gold standard. But what I want to emphasize is once you have, like, let's say 3 or 4 years of data on teachers, these gains are not small, right? They're still in excess of $1 million. So, while it's true, the critics often argue that value-added estimates are very unstable and there's a lot of noise in these measures. That's absolutely right, and that's why there's a gap between this red line and this line here. But there's still a lot of information in these test score-based measures. That's the point I'm trying to convey with this graph. So let me conclude. I think the lesson of our research at a broad level is really simple. Teachers have huge impacts on society. I think test scores can provide one useful input into evaluating teachers, but there's a question of whether you want to use only test scores. Most likely you want to combine it with many other measures that can be useful in evaluating teacher quality. And I think that's something on which we need to do more work to figure out the optimal way to help teachers get better and help evaluate teachers. More generally, just stepping back a bit from these particular studies, I think the broader lesson for an economist or a social scientist is that it's critical for students in the US to have access to high-quality teaching regardless of their socioeconomic background. I think, unfortunately, in the US, we're in a situation where some kids have access to great teaching and great resources in schools, and others don't. And so that's actually something I'm investigating with a group of researchers at Harvard now in our current project, where we're studying how opportunities to move up the economic ladder vary across zip codes in the United States. So for every zip code in the US, we're going to calculate what is the chance that a kid from, say, a low-income family what is the probability that he reaches the median or reaches the top of the income distribution, and how does that vary across zip codes in the US? And what we hope to do based on that analysis is figure out which policies give kids the greatest access to moving upward in the income distribution. That is, our broader goal with this agenda is to figure out how we can improve policy to give all children in the US access to the American dream in substance. And broadly, our sense is that teachers and education are a key factor in that. So thank you very much.
So can we have any questions from I'll walk close.
Hi. I'm curious if the impact of a star teacher was dependent on what grade you had the star teacher in.
Yeah, that's a great question. Unfortunately, I didn't bring that graph with me, but it turns out that to the extent we can tell, it's basically flat across the grades we're able to study from kindergarten to 8th. So there's a lot of discussion in the literature of very early childhood education being far more important than later grades. We don't find any evidence of that in our data.
Hi, I'm actually doing my dissertation on in, I guess, correlation of standardized test scores in New Jersey on kids who are in one alternative education district. So I'm looking at kids that are in a detention center and kids that are in 3 alternative schools, 1 middle school and 2 other high schools. And your research spoke to, of course, the value-added teacher, their ability to raise, I'm assuming it was standardized test scores, okay? But the question in my mind is if I want to look at the ability to correlate the test scores with the students not being able to not keep going back into either being incarcerated or going back into the alternative system. Do you kind of, and I don't know if I'm saying it right. So it's complicated as you already, so I'm kind of in a pickle. I'm 3rd year on this thing. And so I'm trying to pick your brain a little bit about some of the things that I could possibly look at in addition to the test scores to show if there's some kind of a correlation between the classroom teacher who's highly effective and the test scores and their ability not to keep going back into jail or back into the alternative school system.
So that's a great question. I'm delighted that you're trying to explore that question. So one of the shortcomings of our study, as I mentioned, is we aren't able to look at outcomes like crime or going back to jail. As I said, the source of our data are tax records and social security records, and you don't see in tax returns whether somebody ended up in, had those outcomes. So you need to turn to a different data source, I think. So the innovation of this study is really showing that you can learn a lot by linking the standardized test databases, which many people have used, to other data sets to get a lot of insight into what's going on. So the question you pose is basically another version of that. Can we somehow link these school district data sets to databases, say, on who's in jail or criminal activity and so forth? That's hard to do. I don't know anyone who's actually successfully done that yet, but I know a lot of people are interested in doing it. I would think that if you, I don't know exactly how it works in New Jersey, but maybe there's some way to get records from certain prisons or the judicial system or something like that in order to answer your specific question. There might also be other outcomes you can look at which are along the way, not exactly that, but related to that type of outcome, like you said, going into some other alternative school or ending up in a different, in other economic situations. I think the challenge you face is how do you actually get such data? I don't have great insight for you in exactly how to go about doing that. But another challenge one faces is how to go beyond correlations and actually documenting the causal effect of those environments. And so the other thing I'd urge you to think about is how you can develop kind of like a quasi-experimental design so that it's sort of like random that one kid ended up with this teacher or in this school and another kid didn't, and then you can trace the long-term impacts. I think your analysis can be much more powerful if you can make those causal statements. I think it's a great area.
Hi, so I have a kind of technical question. I'm wondering, when we're trying to identify these high value-added teachers, wouldn't the value-added metric be biased against teachers who teach in really high-performing schools? Just because there's no room for improvement? If I'm a teacher and I get 98% proficiency coming in, and if I inherit these classes, there's no room to improve those classes.
Yeah. That's a great question. So let me answer that question in 2 steps. So first, the important thing to remember is that when we measure teacher value added, using this 3-step procedure, the first thing that's crucial to recall is that you are not penalizing teachers whose students start out at different parts of the distribution because you're computing test score gains, right? But then you raise a natural question, which is, what if your students happen to be very far up the scale? There isn't just that much capacity to gain more. So while I was showing you some results with percentiles, The key thing that you have to do to get this right is actually not use a percentile measure where there's a well-defined like maximum, because then you have the intuition exactly right that if you have 99 percentile kids, there's nowhere to go, right? But what we actually end up doing is just a raw scaled score. That's what we use to measure the teacher's value added. And so then if you look at the data, you never have a teacher for whom all 30 kids are scoring near perfect in terms of the entire test. So it ends up being the case that you're right, like it could theoretically happen that you have some teacher that is just like at the maximum. But in practice, when you're averaging over 30 kids, you're always somewhat away from the edge, and then we're dealing with that problem statistically.
Sean Cochran reports in a paper published with the research, the Annenberg Institute research, that the confidence interval for ranking could be as great as 34 percentage points.
Absolutely.
So this kind of mirrors what you're saying you characterize as noise in the data. What we characterize as noise, or you do, results in real impact with teachers whose names are published in the newspaper. And I take issue with that practice, and I'd like to know where you stand on that.
Yeah, I don't think it's clear at all that what you want to do is publish teachers' value added by name in the newspaper. I mean, that's not at all the implication of these results. I think what these results show is that value added can be one useful input, perhaps in providing feedback to a teacher about, or to principals about how teachers are doing. I think precisely because of the noise issue, you don't want to put just list value added in the newspaper because it's not even public. I think it's hard to get a sense of the fact that there is this statistical noise, and you can't rely on the